Good afternoon. Support for today's program comes from Key3 Systems, and you can learn all about Key3's digital workplace consulting services on our Open Mic Friday section of our website. That's www.C4SCS.org. I'm Bob Celeste, and welcome to Open Mic Friday.
No, just give me the link.
I think we have some feedback here. Sorry about that. I had a little feedback. So right now, I believe all lines are muted right now, just to minimize background noise. If you have a question for our guest, either go to the web part and raise your hand, or ask a question. Enter a question, and I'll bring you online, and we can have that discussion.
I don't know if this.
So speak.
No, it's not.
It wasn't.
Maybe still trying.
I don't know where that sound is coming. Which one?
Want to try yours? Go get your laptop. I see him.
Okay, so hopefully we can get past the whoever else is speaking over us.
You want to do the link? I mean,
Yeah, he's got a Mac.
Yeah, I know, and I have muted all the. It appears that everybody is muted. Well, let's try and pull this off, David. Sorry about that. David Stefanich is CEO of Rymedi, blockchain-based B2B data transmission solutions for the pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors, and he's going to be sharing his experience on a project with the Mongolian government to eliminate hepatitis C in that region. We had an earlier bit of a very interesting discussion about this, and I hope that this will also be very helpful to you. And again, feel free to start to ask questions as we start to go through this. David, welcome to the show today.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Appreciate you being here, and appreciate you having me on the show.
Definitely have. Just a second, see if I can. I can't tell where the sound is coming from, and everybody looks like they're muted.
He's not even talking. Right?
Yeah, I'm not even talking. Well, this webcam down.
You're out?
It looks like there's a couple of folks maybe on. David, can you speak? Let me see if I've got you.
Yeah, I've got my phone headset on, so I think we'll be fine.
Got you. Okay, so I think I've gotten whatever was going on there taken care of. So just to start out, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and Rymedi and the company itself?
Sure, Bob. James Stefanich, CEO of Rymedi. I've got a background in inorganic chemistry, a master's in software engineering, my MBA is in finance. So Rymedi is a company, been in existence a little over a year and a half. I've been working in the life science industry now for the last 10, 15 years, mainly doing M&A, acquisition, turnaround work in life sciences outside the U.S., probably more than inside the U.S. So we've got a nice breadth of North America regulatory background, international background related to ICHQ7 European directives, and that's where Rymedi was born, with the regulatory needs of our industry globally, and how to leverage technology that's been coming to market in the last 24 months to solve that problem.
Interesting. And how did you get involved with Mongolia? You're a U.S. company, right?
That's correct. We're located in Raleigh, North Carolina. So Mongolia is an interesting story. I had the real pleasure of one of the co-founders, Dr. Jason Cross, was a former Duke faculty and involved with a lot of the philanthropic activities with global health. And during that time, we had the honor and pleasure to meet a gentleman as the chairman of the Onum Foundation. So Naran Basar Destor is the chairman of the largest philanthropic not-for-profit organization in Mongolia. And their mission is to eradicate Hep C in the Mongolian population by 2021. And we had the opportunity for the three of us to start speaking, and Jason was sharing with me how, what's going on in global health and, the challenges associated with bringing wellness programs to emerging markets. And ND shared the opportunity of what's going on in his close relationships with the Mongolian health minister and all levels of government there. And the missing piece of the puzzle was technology that allowed for immutable traceability of the identification, remediation, and the offsetting of the cost associated with removing Hep C. So we flew over January of this year, had a wonderful time. Since then, I guess we just crossed years there, Bob, so that would be last year. So we've been back 3 times doing work, and we're actually engaged deeply in the overall program and the activities associated with curing the population.
So that's a pretty short runway for standing something up with this kind of technology and in the environment of Mongolia.
Yeah, so, absolutely. And one of the things, Bob, that we've found over time is, when you're working in global health and you're doing activities, the best way to understand what's going on in the population is to spend time there. So we find that it's key to be in the trenches, working with the people. We get the opportunity to learn about the culture, the amazing location, get the opportunity to pick up on some of the language and really become part of the solution and the need in those markets. And, it's amazing how people around the world embrace activities when you take the time to explain why you're there, how we're able to move things forward. And that was part of the acceleration process for us.
Interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about the environment and the people that you were working with there?
Oh, absolutely. So if you're aware, Mongolia is the 17th largest country in the world from a landmass perspective, and they've got just under 3 million people. So it's a very large country, which is a distributed population. So Ulaanbaatar is the capital of Mongolia, which has just over 1 million residents today. It's continually growing and expanding, and the rest of the population is living in the countryside, as it's referred to there, in gears, which is the tents you typically see in the advertisements and so forth. And the people were, incredibly welcoming. We actually got to spend some time out in the countryside, working with those individuals. A colleague of ours, Jamie Pina from RTI, which is a large research facility in Raleigh, was there with us. And you start to appreciate the challenges of identification, remediation in countries that have emerging healthcare systems, and they're looking for the advancements that are, commonplace in the West. But they just haven't had the opportunity and the investment in infrastructure to bring those solutions there. So everyone was incredibly welcoming.
Interesting. What kind of infrastructure did you start with? Like, what kind of, as you kind of hit the ground, and just like you said, it's interesting. It's a very large company, dispersed population. As far as infrastructure that you can rely on.
Right. Putting in something like this is a multi-tenant solution to be successful. There's the cultural piece of understanding what is going on with the people, and how a population that has an infection rate of about 8.5% in Mongolia. I mean, understanding globally the infection rate is about 1 to 2%, and then how the population got to that level of infection, and you start to see the faces of the people that are infected. And Hep C is a notoriously interesting disease in the fact that it slowly, migrates from Hep C over to cirrhosis of the liver, ultimately liver cancer, which is a long gestation period, to negative effects in your life, and then how you can remediate it early with some of the medications that are in the state. So, in able to do that, we had to, one, walk through the process of what they currently have. And one of the exciting things that we discovered in Mongolia was the population identification that is out there. So in the U.S., you have a social security card. It typically doesn't have an image on it. It doesn't have barcoding. It doesn't have HIV integration. Mongolia, to their due diligence, took the time to be sure that the population's identification cards have QR codes embedded in them, HID cards, so there's not counterfeit everyone has a citizen number that can be tied to identify who in market is being tested at that given time, which was pretty exciting. The other part is they've done a really great job with a national pharmaceutical platform for the disbursement of pharmaceutical products in country. So we had the gap between, we could identify who the people are and how do we follow through all those steps from identification to bringing in rapid diagnostic tests to being sure the technicians were being trained to administer those tests, what a positive was in market, and how do we notify others in the overall wellness chain associated with how do we do the secondary test, where is that equipment located, are the technicians in those locations trained to be testing, how do you take a distributed transaction where the person that administers the rapid diagnostic is not the individual who's administering the follow-up testing, and how do you keep continuity all the way through that process to prescription, all the way to delivery of the medication, and ultimately to wellness, which is the goal. So there's many things along with the technologies that enable that overall process.
I think one of the things that you mentioned that's really interesting, and I key in on this because I come from a standards background, and we always talk about identifiers and things like that to be able to enable things. And as you know, in the U.S., you have many patient IDs based on what doctor you go to, what hospital, what clinic. That's a huge starting point that you had there, where you were able to identify a patient across the company in many different venues that you can take advantage of.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was nice about the overall process is, laying out this patient pathway to wellness. So taking that from, patient identification through diagnostics, through follow-up, through prescription, through delivery of the pharmaceutical product, the challenges in that market, to your point, the identification of the patient wasn't the challenging one. The challenging parts were how do we make sure the secondary tests are actually executed, and how do we facilitate the delivery of the pharmaceutical product, where in the U.S. it's significantly more expensive than it is in that market when the GDP of the market is, $2,400 U.S. a year. So the challenges were value-based medicine delivery of the pharmaceutical product and integration in the distributed landscape. If we were in another part of the world, identification may be the problem when the population is condensed and maybe they're privy to, a pharmaceutical supply chain that is more integrated into their everyday existence. So the pathway definition and ability to bring it to market in Mongolia, we call it Rymedi Labs because they've been amazing to work with, but it gave us a way that we could do reproducible processes globally, depending not only on the disease state, which this one happens to be hepatitis C, but we could, HIV, TB, as other rapid diagnostic tests are in the market, the process, it works supported in the distributed emerging markets.
Interesting. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the process, and is this a good time for me to bring up the process flow that you had provided?
Yeah, Bob, I think that would be great to do a nice visual for people to take a look at and walk through. That'd be great. Perfect. So I'll walk through the process with you here, Bob, and there's a few regulatory acronyms that I'm going to use, and I'll explain them as I go. But the important thing to remember during this is, the Rymedi, our company was driven and developed with a blockchain protocol purpose. You can go through and you can capture data. You can go through and track data. That's great. But we see the best solution is being able to capture, track, and share that information in a trusted and immutable way, which facilitates the diverse regulatory landscape around the world. Okay? So with that being said, on the left-hand side, you see the small factory, green and purple on there. That's where the rapid diagnostic test is actually manufactured. And people on the call that are familiar with this topic will understand CGMP manufacturing, so common good manufacturing processes. We want to know that test coming from that facility is within the viable date of use, so it doesn't have an expiration date, and you need to know the lot associated with it. Conjunction with this, some of the DSCSA regulations that have been coming to market, we actually became law, I believe, middle of last year and become enforceable here in a couple more years. We're going to start thinking more and more about lot traceability, not just in our four walls, but outside our four walls and how those products are used all the way down to the patient. So at that first step, we were able to bring that through, and you're going to notice the first field technician at the top, right to the right of it.
Mm-hmm.
When we did that process, we applied GLP, which is good laboratory practices, along with a CGMP feel for that lot. So at that step, we did three things. So we have three roles that are actually done there. One is the rapid diagnostic test. I know is compliant and is traceable and has a certificate of or a COA associated with it. I know that I've identified the patient now because we spoke about the identification card. And more importantly, I use that identification card as well to show that the technician has been trained to administer that test, right? So now I have three touch points that are validated in the distributed ledger that show when it was given and how it was administered and how it was interpreted. Now, we're all familiar with diagnostic tests and market and how there can be a human bias associated. And I always tell the analogy to my family about a pregnancy test. People look at it and go, there's one line, two line, is it anxious time? It could be misread. So what we did to mitigate that is we actually grab a photograph of that test in field and attach it to the entire genealogy. So anywhere downstream can go back and reference to be sure that individual read that test properly, and we know exactly when it was administered.
Okay.
Now, one aspect we believe in market, as we talked about earlier, is there's wellness in the market. There's a disease state cure that we're trying to bring to market. We're trying to bring innovation and technology advancement to market so that we can train Mongolian people to not just use the technology, but understand how to mature and develop it further. Our larger mission is to be the next country we go engage with, that individuals from Ulaanbaatar will be traveling with us so that we can foster the adoption of global health around. And the way we did that on the wellness side here, Bob, was when we did the first test, we were looking at the children and we were looking at the parents, and they reminded me of my four daughters. And I could see the look in their eyes, like, why are these people here? What's going on? And I didn't speak any Mongolian at the time, but during that window, I was able to get with the Onum Foundation and Noran Bata Dastor and say, how can we fill this 8 minutes of awkward science into something that is better for the Mongolian people? And he shared with me that the second leading cause of death there after Hep C would be hypertension. So we took that opportunity to integrate into the platform an educational video so that during that time, we're explaining hypertension, we're explaining Hep C, we're explaining why we're there, what the process is. And that is it's hard to measure that qualitative impact when we're explaining what's going on across the country that's really distributed in their knowledge and sharing and information channels. So we were super excited about really understanding it isn't just a tech play, it's a population play. Okay. As you can see from the next building that's on there, they notified the clinician, and coming from a manufacturing background, my question, most of my clients in the past were, what are your KPIs? How do you measure your business? So when I was speaking with them, I was like, how do you know how many people are tested positive and how many people are tested negative in market? There was ancillary reports, there was things after. So what we've done is if there's a positive, we actually send a notification over to the lab to say, hey, here's a picture of the test that was given. Here's the identification of the technician that was administering the test. And then they can use that information to get several values for their business out of it. One, making sure they have enough equipment there to handle the people that are going to be coming. Two, if people are found positive in the market, are they showing up? How long does it take for them to show up? And what can they do from an instructional video perspective to incentivize them to show up for the secondary test to be sure that the viral load, which is done after the fact, can actually give them the dual identification of positive so that they can prescribe through the national health system the medication they need. So we applied enterprise software practices and enterprise operations to this process to help mature efficiencies so that we could bring the dollars that are spent on the people and the solution and not lost in the noise associated with it.
Okay, and you're adding like the incentives to the patient in terms of education in order to get them back and continue the process with them.
Yes. One other piece, Bob, that we were thinking about, and we're working closely with the finance minister, is that when people watch the video and they participate and they follow through both steps, how do we exchange a health voucher or a health token that can be exchanged for future healthcare costs? So we're really taking it to another step from a fiscal perspective of how to continue to drive down the cost of wellness as well as incentivize as we're going and modify behavior, which is always the number one challenge in health, right? If you exercise more and eat right, your health will improve. How do we incentivize behavioral changes that align with wellness goals of a country?
Interesting, and fits in with the lifestyle or the patient and the process that you're trying to put together here.
Absolutely. The next step that we did, we got to the point where we were able to provide interesting information from a value perspective from the process, and I'll touch base on that real quick. One of the things that's the most challenging in the diagnostic world is how do you find false negatives, right, in the market, when the only way you find them is continual testing, and then you fall, oh, I have an error. Well, what we've been able to do is the rapid diagnostic manufacturers, now they know how their product is being used in market, by whom, and when it's being used. Now, after the secondary test comes back, at that instant, you can say the more precise, more expensive secondary test came back positive from that individual and aligned with the positive that was done in the field, which is great. More importantly, if the negative, they were false in market, but down the road, their health record says that they just developed cirrhosis of the liver, liver cancer. That didn't happen overnight, right? That's a 5 to 7 year process. They'll be able to circle back and say the rapid diagnostic test was a false negative because the individual's wellness continued to deteriorate in that disease state space, right? So that's just, it's unheard of in industry today. And we're really looking at a lot of ways to expand that value prop and close that feedback loop, because once the rapid diagnostic test leaves the plant, how do you know how it's being used in market, how it's performing in market? The quality assurance back to rapid diagnostics, that kind of feedback to the manufacturer will just help drive down costs and bring more of those healthcare dollars to the market and save individuals. So we're excited how we're going to continue to mature this over time.
So can I interject someone from the audience that has a question?
Please.
And I think this will be interesting from tying it back down to blockchain and why that's being used. So I'm going to just see if Stefan's on.
Yeah, hey Bob, can you hear me?
Hey Stefan. Yep, you're on.
Yeah, so well, thanks for doing this. My question was, why did this actually need a blockchain? Why not just simply implement the state-run EMR system and track things there?
Yeah. So one of the beautiful things about blockchain, so let's talk about the technology for a second, and then we'll get a direct answer to your question. When I'm looking at information that's going to be distributed between parties, 10, 15 years ago, people used EDI in manufacturing. You had, here's my incoming material, here's my outgoing material, and it was a peer-to-peer kind of communication channel. Now, from a distributed ledger perspective, the information at the manufacturer is private information that maybe possibly is not shared with the test labs. And the test lab results from a PII and a PHI perspective are actually mapped and shared out that way. So the question will be then, from a data governance policy in Mongolia, so all their information needs to reside in the national data center. From a manufacturer, those rapid diagnostic tests are done in North America. The people executing it are distributed around the world and they're done in different markets. So in a blockchain environment, what we as Rymedi really like about blockchain isn't always the buzz you hear in the news. It's the fact that I have immutable genealogy associated with that record. So once that record is written to a ledger, it's immutable. It'll never change. So in a 210, 211 world, from a CGMP perspective, change control is always a question. So how do we know the record of truth? And how do we know aggregation of metadata between different characters and roles in a much broader value chain? So because the manufacturer could be on one platform, the lab could be on a different platform, the follow-up lab could be on a third platform, and the pharmaceutical system could be on another platform. All that information is not EMR driven. It all ties back to that character, and it's permissioned behind a secure barrier where there's private accessibility and there's public genealogy. One of the things we did at Rymedi is be sure that the public distributed ledger can be read by all, and it points to, with a metadata pointer, the private data that's secured behind encryption and security to fulfill the various regulatory conditions that are associated around the world. So in our world, one system doesn't fit all for this model in this market, and we had to have the interoperability associated with the dynamics of platforms and adoption in the different markets.
Interesting. So was this part of the strategy for using blockchain, this whole problems area that you just were talking about, the distributed parties in the supply chain, and some of the regulation rules that you have to comply with?
Absolutely. So the concept of the product itself began about 3.5 years ago, doing some regulatory work in OTC pharmaceutical companies and other distribution pharmaceutical companies around. And what we found was when you're doing qualification and validation in the pharmaceutical world, and when you do software change control, I mean, there's a process. There's a user analysis, a risk analysis, a functional design, an IQ, PQ. It's a very structured way to bring technology to market. Well, the best way that we could find to remediate those controls were to do 3 things that we built into the protocol. Again, a protocol that's not being used is a useless protocol in our opinion. And some of the challenges in our market is the fact that regulatory compliance is cost prohibitive, it stifles innovation, and doesn't really feed wellness to market. So we thought, how do we address that? And we did it in a couple ways. We built a data object in a way with a technology-based backbone that allows us to fork the object based on the regulatory climate. So there is never going to be one data object that solves all regulatory problems. So you need to have a flexible data object that can be leveraged, but the meta backbone is always pointing to the right location. That was one piece. The second piece was, how do we handle electronic signatures and 2-factor authentication? So folks in the US are very familiar with CFR 21 Part 11. There's similar signatures that have to be done on the transaction. What we did is we built it into the protocol mechanism. So we do it on all transactions by default. So it isn't I have a transaction set, how do I make it compliant? We approach it as we have a protocol that facilitates a compliant nature based on the regulatory landscape that you're residing in for that given process. And then thirdly, we had to address data sovereignty policies and approaches for companies, countries, as well as different individuals. And how do we handle that is by running it on a distributed ledger that can have computational nodes in country as well as distributed, because let's think about it. Tenofovir, which is part of the cure for Hep C, is formulated in the US and they're doing research on it. Rapid diagnostics tests are actually executed in countries around the world. How do we tie the effectiveness of the treatment back to the diagnostics, to the individual, to the patient? So by having those distributed nodes, it fosters network effects that can actually bring innovation quicker, where the regulatory space isn't a hindrance. It's a sustainable competitive advantage because it's adopted into the process. We believe Deming had it right. You don't inspect inequality, you build quality in the processes and tools, and you follow those, it'll enable innovation. So that's the reason we chose blockchain. It wasn't a fact that we heard about blockchain and then we had to find an industry. We came from an industry and found a technology that was completely applicable to a challenge we had in market.
Interesting. So I want to dive in a little bit in a minute on the metadata pointers and an issue around privacy and confidentiality. But we do have Frank on the line that has a question for you also. Let's see, Frank, are you?
Sure.
Just open you up. Frank, can you hear us? Oh, maybe. Well, let me just say what Frank. Oh, okay, sorry, Frank is off the air, but he was saying that it's a brilliant way to collaborate with stakeholders to come up with the right solution. And he wanted to ask, was it helpful or more difficult to work with developing country infrastructure? I think that's Frank's question.
Sure. One of the things that we found out, and this is an experience thing in my past life, I remember I was involved in a large North American company that did an acquisition in Benoni, South Africa. And we actually rolled out an ERP package. I won't share the name, but a large, highly integrated ERP package, and all the testing went well in the US. And I would get to this emerging country, and it doesn't run at all. And I'm like, we did the speed test, and we looked out in the parking lot and realized the trucks in the driveway were running over the coax line. And that was the first time I really got exposed to be sure you understand where you are when you're building out platforms. And that is really the way we looked at the technology stack. You know, when you're using a protocol-based solution and you're thinking about the DAP, there's a dynamic application, which is either reading QR code or RFIDs or even getting manual data input, we had to think about how do we make it light and how do we make it so it's regulatory compliant. And what we found is following CSS, HTML5, JSON-based responsive code base and running multilingual on the way in, we built the application space so it runs very, very light. We also found that in places when you have a distributed infrastructure and cell coverage, there was a special place in Mongolia when I actually received the directions and said, go through this next valley, take a right at the mountain, and you'll run into the next group of tents. When you're out there, you have to be able to collect the data, and then when you come back on site, you can actually sync it back up and follow through. You never deviate from the process, but in a global world and in emerging markets, you have got to be very cognizant that not all tech runs the same everywhere around the world. And it goes back to one of our axioms within Rymedi. You know, we can't engineer solutions sitting in our offices in Raleigh, North Carolina. We need to be out with people. We learned about the video. We learned about the culture. We learned about the fears, customs, and concerns in these markets by being there. And, you know, again, protocol that's not used is useless protocol. Technology that's not used is not bringing value. And being with these people, you feel it when you're there, traveling through Asia. I had explained to my spouse that, you know, Facebook and Google and some other things don't work real well, so we better have a certain voice over IP app so I can contact home. But again, you'll learn about the market by living in the market. And I can't stress to anyone on the call how important it is to embrace the people and what you're trying to do and not lose sight of that mission, that the reason you're there is not to further advance technology, it's to leverage a tool to bring what the mission is. And one of our core axioms is wellness in markets that we have the opportunity and the pleasure to go visit.
Nice, interesting. One more question, and we'll continue on with the discussion on the process. And that's coming from Eric. Eric, did you have a question?
No, I'm sorry. I did not.
Okay, sorry, Eric.
Apologize for that. Not sure why it registered.
It just had your hand up. No problem. So David, back to what was interesting that you had talked about was this metadata pointer, and the reason why I find that interesting is that, you know, very often with blockchains, all the data is visible, but yet really people don't want all the data visible because of confidentiality and privacy and things like that. So can you explain a little bit about how you manage that through these kind of techniques that you're using?
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about the approach. So being a CIO of companies in the past, one of the worst conversations I would ever have is I'd walk to the CEO and say, hey, that $5 million you spent 2 years ago is great, but I want you to convert to this because it's better, right? And that was one of those conversations that no one likes to have because you feel like it's at lost cost. And when we architected Rymedi and the platform itself, and we built in the regulatory controls, we built in the regulatory requirements from a global perspective, we also thought about how do we make sure that it's interoperable. So Rymedi is based on two premises. One is public chain. So we're looking at that process. So think about the horizontal as the public chain, and think about those two clinics as private chains. Now the question is, how do you go from a public chain to a private chain? And there's a technique, you can go read some white papers that are out there. It's called UTX, unspent transactions. We were very cognizant of being sure that interoperability was there. So if the private side, if someone has a blockchain strategy already inside their enterprise, we're happy to tie to it. If you don't have a blockchain strategy inside your enterprise, we'd be happy to be that one, but we will always be the public pointers to that permission data. And when you're on a private chain, we can do things where we have an encryption hash where the metadata describes the state of the information. So these people were doing rapid diagnostics for this disease state, and maybe they decided it's okay to share our metadata that they sampled 25,000 people. And then down the road, a company that's looking at how to leverage that information that was gathered could contact Mongolia and say, okay, with this exchange of a token for access to your private chain so we can incorporate it, now we're starting building in some network economies that where you can have permission and permissionless. Now remember, our goal is for betterness and wellness across the population. So training individuals, wellness and healthcare, education. In these emerging countries, we've provided them a mechanism by which they can improve their national GDP by being able to monetize this valuable information that they've acquired. And Bob, you might have seen the real world evidence paper that just came out by the FDA. You know, that's super exciting to us because it's going to be available for these markets to say, hey, we've been grabbing everything on an immutable ledger. We have a structure that's regulatory control. How can this information be leveraged for reducing a clinical trial cost or accelerating speed to market? I mean, the possibilities are endless because we thought about we want to have interoperability. We don't want to say, if the whole world runs on Rymedi, we're fine. Trust me, we would love it, but it doesn't have to be to deliver our mission to market.
Gotcha. Interesting. And I think what's interesting there is that you're touching on aspects of, well, monetization, but also value to the patient in this network and not having that data be used unless the patient is aware of it and has given permission.
Right, absolutely. And you know, there's a strategic partner of ours from Humanity. It's a company that's really promoting the identification and the availability of the individual to receive monetary gain from the use of their information. And you know, we're really excited to be working closely with Humanity. Richie Etwar, their CEO, we've had multiple conversations, and by thinking about how we help move forward that initiative of the 31st human right that's being discussed out in the market now, people can have title ownership of their information and then monetize that for their own personal, you know, gain is amazing when you have a GDP that's $2,400 a year, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, we're starting to, you know, you hear the old trickle-down economy and economics and so forth. This is really putting power into the individual. When they participate in their wellness and they have longer lives and a higher quality of healthcare, there's multiple ways to bring that to market. And proper strategic partners that are doing amazing things around the world, and Rymedi is honored to be associated with them. Absolutely honored to be associated and working closely with the IEEE. The Blockchain and Healthcare Group was just formed We're very proud to say that we're a contributing member to that organization, defining these standards. And, it's a global community that allows macro impact to these markets.
Very interesting. And that's sort of the difficult to explain in an elevator pitch why blockchain is exciting is this almost democratization of information.
Right. And it's funny. We always have this conversation that sometimes during the conversation I'm an inorganic chemist, another minute I'm a technologist, and the other one I'm an MBA talking about revenue gain. Because when you look at even this patient pathway we have on the screen, right? We've got different verticals. We have multiple players in a vertical that being able to run in a distributed world, it allows for the value to be created. That, in my opinion, 2 years ago, you would have to have this giant integration, all these API services, all these things that are just cost prohibitive outside the US. There's just not the liquidity to go do it. What we've done is put it in the hands of the individuals that can make an impact within those spaces while thinking about the global landscape. Standards are meant to make integration easier, not to be challenging for adoption. Regulatory control is to ensure that when people open a bottle of C4SCS in Mongolia, it's one type of pill and the dosage is correct, right? Counterfeits are a challenge up and down the board. By the grace of God, those challenges don't hit some folks in the U.S., but throughout Central America, Latin America, we run into these challenges, and there's many ways that in many markets that it's just going to make an impact. And a little while ago, we couldn't.
Interesting. So you've walked us through the process where the test goes out and under control and tracking to the field technician. The test is being done on the patient, and that information is being shared, and also feedback loop back to the manufacturer of the test to make sure that they can improve their test, I imagine. And then we've gone through definitely down to where there's a second screening for the patient. And on your diagram, now we've got the phase 2 approach where now we're going to start to treat the patient, I imagine, and the different actors and players that are going to be involved in that. Can you talk a little bit about that end, where you're going?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've gotten to a point now is getting to integration with our healthcare system. To the earlier question that I believe Frank had, how do we start tying that information down to an EHR record, and then how do we tie that back to the pharmaceutical, and then ultimately how do we realize that value from a payer financing perspective? I mentioned earlier in the call that the prescription platform, they have a national prescription platform today, and we are currently will be going back over to Mongolia, I believe around the week of the 18th of this month, working further into that value prop. So our goal is to take it all the way through the process, working closely with each of the parties as we move forward to really show that when the eradication of Hep C occurs in Mongolia in 2021, that this process is scalable, reproducible, and it's an end-to-end value prop. We look at those different hexagons that you see on the screen as the Rymedi value arc. It's a daunting task if you look at it holistically, but what we've done by stepping into it from a diagnostic to follow-up, we've been walking through the process, having established organizations kind of bolt on. That's going to show that process can go completely through. So that's our goal to get done by mid 2019. The interesting part is the first half of the screen when folks are looking at it and thinking, wow, this is pretty daunting. From the time that we went over to map the process until we went over and actually demo it at World Hepatitis C Day in Mongolia, it was 5 weeks.
Wow.
Because we built the platform out in a modular sense, those modules can be reapplied and repurposed over and over and over again. So again, enabling wellness, understanding the process, understanding the macro picture, and then making it a reproducible solution that can scale across disease states, multilingual, multi-security, multi-infrastructure with the same speed and rigidity. of trust. I mean, that's our vision for 2019.
Interesting. So you're going to be starting to interconnect the actual doctor's offices for treatment, and then I guess just like you did with the test kit itself, the pharmaceutical then be tracking how well that's doing on patients and be able to pull information from that.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the exciting things for us is like right now, the cure for Hep C is actually, it's brought in, it's manufactured in North America, and it's brought in for that distribution tracking. But we have signed contracts with the largest pharmaceutical company that's in Mongolia, Mongolia Pharmaceutical, and it's been a real honor to really be part of the most successful company since the change of Soviet control, and to work closely with them, and it's been great because they're looking at how do they manufacture it in FDA CGMP mindset to bring those products outside of Mongolia, as well as integrate and produce products that are going to be able to cure conditions within the Mongolian population. So, I mean, that's a step that the industry in that country didn't really conceive until we started working collaboratively together. And now the chairman and Dr. Gastor and ourselves are pretty excited about working that through. So what we're doing there was just a scratch on a beaker. It starts to crystallize and catalyze into something amazing. It's going to have multiple facets on it. So we're really excited for 2019 and taking this all the way through. And when we get all the way done, Bob, we'll have another chat with you and say,
Great.
Okay, we've got it done in market. Where do we go next? That's going to be our big challenges.
Do you see in this next phase now, one of the things that you brought up earlier in the conversation was the price difference between within Mongolia and outside, and certainly that provides opportunity for diversion because of that. Is that something that might be part of this next phase of tracking the drugs itself?
Well, you've got a couple challenges. So you've got a product that's manufactured in the U.S. that commands a higher price point than it does on kind of an emerging market, okay? So from that perspective, if you work out a value-based medicine play with a manufacturer that's in North America and they do a discount for a country, anyone that has a business background would want to be sure that that product that's sold at a discount gets to the market and the individuals that are going to be cured, not somehow diverted over to, let's say, an aftermarket, okay?
Right.
So back to that whole purpose of why you have, distributed ledger technology is to help them and everyone in the value chain feel more comfortable that what's being brought in to solve the solution is getting to the individual that I can identify that's already been shown to be tested positive. Okay? So when you're removing risk from business transactions, you speed up adoption and you speed up overall trust and security. Okay? So by doing all of those pieces, it accelerates what you're able to do. Now, in market, let's say you're an emerging country and you have to secure, global financing, let's say from the World Bank, to fund some of these projects. Having trusted information through the entire value proposition allows for that financial institution to feel more comfortable. Again, everything's about mitigating risk, to bring down the risk associated with backing a wellness program in an emerging market, because everyone in the entire transaction has clear visibility of that transaction and how it occurred. So there's many tenants, there's IP liability, there's many pieces of business continuity that we were able to enable on the backside, which I really believe is going to open up some of the markets that haven't been doing as well as Mongolia has been doing over the past few years. And again, remember I talked earlier, every market has their own challenges. And being modular and interoperable on a business climate, identification, traceability, access, all of those have to be balanced by market to bring this patient pathway reproducibly to market. Interesting.
It's interesting what you're talking about, new players coming into this ecosystem and working with the patients in the hospitals because there is secure data. In one of our previous shows, we had a group on that was doing fish traceability, and the same thing started to occur there, that because the data was immutable and it was accessible, these small fish farmers were getting financing. The government was starting to be able to put up grants because they had data that they needed to make those kind of decisions. Is that the same kind of thing that you're seeing here in the payer financing area, that last block there?
Absolutely. I mean, that is a crux, and that's a value that not many people, again, when we speak blockchain, they've been inundated with too much news and too many videos, and it takes a little while to kind of peel back the onion to understand the value, but you're exactly right. And what's interesting for us is, there's other industries out there that are being legalized, that are becoming Schedule 4 OTC pharmaceutical products. I'll leave it at that. But they want to know how to be FDA compliant in their emerging markets. They want to know how to do all these same things. And what's really great about the Rymedi protocol is that we don't change the code. We barely change the process. We just plug the different pieces in, and we'll actually be at blockchain in Washington, D.C. on the 14th and 15th, speaking with some individuals about an opportunity that we're going to be down in Mexico, tracking, certain tequilas are made in certain places. How do you guarantee it? How do you trace mangoes? We'll also be speaking in some places. There's a lot of immutable genealogy that, if applied to a market, is creating value and business opportunities. And when we got into the Rymedi, this construction, we knew our industry. We speak life sciences, we speak electronic collaboration, we speak clinicals, we speak manufacturing and distribution. On the agricultural side, we're seeing a lot of the same pieces, and the processes we have are at a higher state of regulatory control. So it's almost easier to be regulatory compliant in these not as stringent regulatory landscapes by using processes we've already done. So that's a pretty exciting space for us to grow in 2019 as well.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you for being on the show today. I mean, there is a tremendous amount to dig into in what you presented today. So I wanted to ask you if you would mind coming back at some point. I think that we've probably got a couple of different tracks we can delve into that folks would be interested in, not only in-country work, the technology itself. I'm sure that I know that there are people on our call that would like to kind of dig into that and really kind of grill you a little bit on how that all works.
Yeah, no, we'd be more than happy to, Bob, anytime. And the people that are listening to the webinar today, we're open about collaboration. We believe it's going to take a large global group to pull all these things together. So we love collaborating with new partners. We love sharing what we've done. We pretty much will fly anywhere in the world. That's kind of one of our axioms. So anyone that wants to reach out to us, please do so. We've always got time, and we're all about the collaboration because it takes many people to bring wellness to market, and we want to be accelerating that, not impeding in any way. So please reach out.
Great. Thanks, David. I appreciate you being on the call today, and you have a great weekend. And for folks, please join us next week when our guests will be Brennan Isabel from Notablock, and we'll be talking about blockchain, cybersecurity, and digital identity. So a pretty good tie-in to what we were talking about today. Thanks, David, and we'll be posting this up on our site for anyone to get at. If you have questions for David, we'll provide you his link and contact information. Please reach out to him.